surface conditions help set the stage for the spring outlook. I'll start with our spring drought outlook. Drought is expected to improve further or go away completely across much of California and the Great Basin. The spring wet season should also help to improve drought across the northern and central plains, where some areas are currently experiencing severe to exceptional drought conditions. Severe to exceptional drought coverage also extends into parts of the southern plains, but is unlikely to improve much during the spring season, with drought also expanding into parts of New Mexico. This may bring an increased risk of wildfires to this region, particularly when high winds are present. Across parts of the Northwest US and the Northern Rockies, drought conditions are expected to continue. Drought may develop in parts of Washington state as well. Near-term heavy rain threats in Florida and the normal onset of the rainy season are expected to ease or eliminate drought conditions there by the end of June. Outside the contiguous US, drought may develop the spring season across portions of Puerto Rico as well. Looking at the spring temperature outlook, warmer than average temperatures are favored for much of the southern and eastern half of the US. The greatest chances exist from the southern plains to the Gulf Coast and up the eastern seaboard. There are also probabilities for above normal temperatures across Hawaii and northern Alaska. Below average temperatures are most likely for the central Great Basin and the northern plains. For the spring precipitation outlook, below normal precipitation is most favored across the southwest US and parts of the Pacific Northwest. Above normal precipitation chances are present for the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, and into parts of the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. That concludes my remarks, and with that, I will turn it over to Ed, who will speak about this year's spring flood risk outlook.
Thank you, John. I'm pleased to provide the 2023 National Hydrologic Assessment, a collaboration between the National Water Center, regional offices, and the National Weather Service River Forecast Centers. NOAA categorizes flood risk as minor, moderate, major, or record flooding. You can see the news release for definitions of these categories, but in brief, minor flooding means that minimal or no property damage, but roads may be inundated. Moderate flooding means some inundation of structures and roads near waterways. And major flooding means extensive inundation of structures and roads. Record flooding is when flooding meets or exceeds historical levels. Please be advised that this outlook is on the timescale of weeks to months, not days or hours, and localized flooding may be caused by heavy, intense rainfall at any time. This year, approximately 146 million people are at risk for flooding in their communities, with an additional 6.4 million at risk for moderate flooding. There is an estimated 1.4 million people at risk for major flooding. Earlier this week, near record snowpack across California, combined with heavy rainfall from the most recent atmospheric river event, led to widespread flooding throughout the state. While floodwaters in many areas are beginning to recede, minor and moderate flooding is ongoing in the Upper Sacramento and Salinas River basins. California's near record snowpack will lead to continued potential for flooding this spring, particularly if additional rainfall occurs. There is a risk of moderate flooding for rivers and streams along the Sierra Nevada foothills from the Cosumnes south through the Kern River drainage. This spring, NOAA is projecting moderate to major flooding in the upper Mississippi River basin. This is focused along the main stem Mississippi from the Twin Cities in Minnesota to St. Louis, Missouri. Portions of the Red River of the North in North Dakota and the James and Vermilion Rivers in South Dakota may experience moderate flooding this spring due to greater than normal snowpack. Moderate flooding is also projected on tributaries of the Missouri River in Missouri and Illinois River in Illinois. Additionally, moderate flooding is expected along the lower Ohio River downstream of Paducah, Kentucky to the confluence with the Mississippi. Elsewhere, NOAA is projecting areas of minor flooding throughout much of the eastern half of the continental US, including along the main stem lower Mississippi downstream of Cape Girardeau. Due to the much above normal snowpack and even record conditions across California, the Great Basin, the Colorado, and the Upper Snake River basins, minor flooding can be expected in these areas during the snowmelt season. In these regions, the risk of flooding may increase due to heavy rainfall and rapid warming. And flash flooding or debris flows risk is high over burn scars from recent wildfires. For Alaska, the spring ice breakup and the snowmelt flood potential is forecasted to be near normal. Additional river basins with risk of spring flooding are identified in our hydrologic assessment, which is linked in the news release on NOAA.gov. This hydrologic assessment also provides information about the nation's critical water supply forecast for agricultural, municipal, and industrial uses. Our National Weather Service river water supply predictions this year are average to much above average over areas of California, the Great Basin, and the Colorado Basin due to well above normal snowpack. In contrast, across the Pacific Northwest, current normal to below normal snowpack conditions lead to average to below average water supply forecasts. Finally, water supply is projected to be above average across much of the eastern slope of the Rockies due to below to much below normal snowpack combined with ongoing dry soil conditions. The National Hydrologic Assessment also provides a first look at some of the major drivers influencing summer hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico and Chesapeake Bay. This year's Mississippi River Basin flood forecast is anticipated to result in near normal springtime discharge of nutrients and fresh water. In turn, this will create conditions for an average hypoxic zone of approximately 5,000 square miles in the northern Gulf of Mexico. An average hypoxia zone, or approximately 350 square miles, is projected to develop in the Chesapeake Bay. These predictions are based on the assumption of typical summer conditions, such as tropical storms and or drought. It's important to note that heavy rainfall can lead to flooding at any time, even in areas where the National Hydrologic Assessment does not project flooding. The public can determine whether their community is in a flood risk area by monitoring local flood conditions at water.weather.gov. This concludes the hydrologic outlook, and with that, I will turn it over to Susan to moderate the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And before we move into the Q&A portion of the news conference, I'd like to introduce a few additional experts we have on the line to assist in answering your questions. We have Brad Pugh. He's the operational drought lead for NOAA's Climate Prediction Center. We have Tom DiLiberto. He's a public affairs specialist and climate scientist with NOAA's Communications Office. And we have Brad Rippey, who is a meteorologist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And Brad is here to answer any questions you may have related to agriculture. We also are pleased to have Jeff Jackson join us from FEMA. Jeff is the Deputy Assistant Administrator with FEMA's Federal Flood Insurance and Mitigation Administration. And Jeff will handle any questions you might have related to FEMA and the flood insurance program. And we're also joined today by experts from the National Weather Service's River Forecast Centers, and their names and titles are up on the screen for you to see in case there are any specific questions about specific river basins in the country. And we'll now take your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please click the hand icon in the GoToWebinar window next to your name in the attendees list that appears to the right of your screen. And my colleague John Moore will pop on the screen, and he'll call upon each reporter who has virtually raised a hand. And we'll go one at a time. Once you're called upon, you'll need to unmute yourself. And please be sure to state your full name and your media affiliation before asking your question. And if you know who you're directing your question to, feel free to call out that expert as well. And if you prefer to write your question to us, you can submit a question in the question chat box, and we'll read it for you. And again, be sure to write in your full name and media affiliation, and we'll take those questions at the end. So I'd like to ask for your patience now for a moment while we get the questions lined up. And John, if you're here, please come on the screen and go ahead and take over. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Susan, and I'll be taking your questions for today. All right, first we have Rachel Ramirez. Rachel Ramirez, I will unmute you, and allow you to answer your question. Also, ask you to unmute yourself.
All right, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Rachel.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. This is Rachel Ramirez with CNN. I guess it was mentioned that the Northwest and Southwest will be dry or see below normal precipitation. Can folks talk about, do you think all this faucet of precipitation that's pummeling the West Coast is going to suddenly turn off again? I guess, what are your water supply concerns in the context of this outlook? I'm thinking about how the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, for instance, just lifted their restrictions yesterday, but I'm also curious about the Colorado River Basin. And if I could just throw in one more question, John, it mentioned that this spring NOAA is projecting moderate to major flooding in the upper Mississippi River Basin. Are you thinking maybe that's because the northern states got some decent snow? Can you just provide some more context on that sort of forecast? Thank you.
John, I'll let you take the first question.
Sure. This is John Gottschalk from the Climate Prediction Center. With respect to the atmospheric river events and the above average precipitation that's been evident for quite some time, both in January and now more recently in California, there will be one more event early next week. But right now, our model forecast information that we have and the other climate indicators that we're looking at does look like that will probably shut off as we go into our early part of April. And at that point, normal climatological precipitation for much of California goes towards zero quite quickly. So we do think there'll be a break after this initial first storm that's coming up early next week.
So, Mr. Ramirez, I think the other questions you had were about water supply, both in California and in the Colorado Basin. So I'll point you to Brett from the California-Nevada River Forecast Center, and then also Paul Miller is with us from the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. Brett, maybe start with you.
Sure. Hope you can hear me okay. So in California, really the Central Valley, the Sierra Nevada drainage, West Slopes, the San Joaquin River system, and the Southern Sierra, and in the Tulare Lake bed, all that snowpack is record levels right now. So in terms of seasonal runoff, April, July, we're looking at record, probably 50 to 75% chance of getting record AJ runoff in the San Joaquin system. The Northern California, Northern Sierra drainage for the Sacramento River Basin is probably going to be somewhere in the 9th, maybe highest AJ runoff. So probably a little closer to 2017. So not as significant in the northern part of the state, but the Southern Sierra is really what has record snowpack right now.
Do you want to address the Colorado Basin water supply forecast?
I think I'll pass it over to Paul Miller, who's the Colorado River Basin Forecast Center focal point.
Hi, Brett, and thanks, Ed. I'm Paul Miller. I'm the Service Coordination Hydrologist at the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. And though we haven't been hit as hard as California, we have definitely benefited from the atmospheric river events and other precipitation events over the Colorado River Basin that have really done record-breaking snowpack in some areas of our basin. Most areas in our basin are seeing 130 to 150% of normal snowpack. And for the upper Colorado River Basin, our most popular product that tends to get the most attention is the unregulated inflow forecast into Glen Canyon Dam, which is where Lake Powell is. And our last official forecast was for March 1st, and we were forecasting 125% of average. But with these recent storm events that we've had, our raw guidance is now pushing into that 150% of average range. So we'll do another official forecast near the 1st of April. But this recent storm event has been very beneficial in terms of providing water supply to the basin.
Great. And I think the last question was the conditions driving the flood risk on the upper Mississippi. So I'll turn that over to Masha, our hydrologist at the North Central River Forecast Center. Masha?
Hello, yes, thank you for your question. My name is Masha Hoy, and I'm a hydrologist at the North Central River Forecast Center. And we do have an elevated risk for flooding along the Mississippi River this spring. There's moderate to risk of even major flooding between the Twin Cities in Minnesota to St. Louis. And a big driver of that is the above average snowpack. We've been in a wet pattern, and the snow water equivalent in the snowpack that's still on the ground is in the top 10 or 20% compared to historic years. So there's really just quite a lot of snow water out there, and combined with cold temperatures or temperatures on the colder side for this winter, it hasn't had a chance to melt out slowly yet. So a lot will depend on how quickly the snowpack melts, and it's evolving. So we're keeping an eye on that this spring.
All right, thank you. I think that answers all of your questions, Rachel. Next, we'll go over to Brian Sullivan. Brian, I'm going to unmute you. You can ask your question.
Hey there. I just had a quick clarification here. The water, the rain in California is going to kind of end climatologically towards the end of April or the end of March here, and you show great improvement through the spring. This is all because of the snow runoff. Is that what's improving the conditions there?
Yeah, this is John Gottschalk from the Climate Prediction Center. Yes, that's correct. A lot of that will be the snow melt across much of the West. But I also turn that over to Brad Pugh, who was the author of the Seasonal Drought Outlook this season.
Yeah, hi, Brian.
Hey,
yeah,
Brad.
the improvement, continued improvement through the next month or more is related to the above average snowpack throughout California and the Great Basin. And also we do have this one more atmospheric river event coming early next week, which will provide additional heavy precipitation, especially to northern and central California.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have a question from Rebecca Hersher. And as a reminder, please state your affiliation when you ask your question. I will unmute you, Rebecca.
Hi, this is Rebecca Hersher from NPR. I just had a follow-up about La Nina and El Nino. Can you talk a little bit more about how long you expect the neutral status to last and sort of what's coming later this year, as much as you know? Thanks.
Sure. This is John Gottschalk from the Climate Prediction Center. Yes, we issued our final La Nina advisory earlier this month, and so La Nina has ended. We're currently in ENSO neutral conditions right now, as you mentioned. We expect this to continue through the spring and perhaps into the early summer. Thereafter, we have elevated odds for actually potential development of El Nino for the first time in several years. And the climatological probabilities for that happening are about 60% as we enter the fall and into the early part of the winter. So it's the most favored category of ENSO right now, but there's still quite a bit of uncertainty because forecasts that are initialized and predicted at this point of the seasonal cycle or the year have potentially lower forecast skill during the spring initialization month. So we still have to wait a few more months to be sure whether we might go into El Nino later this year or not. I hope that helps.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. Next on the line, we'll have a question from Dan Chrysler. I'll unmute you now, Dan.
Hi, this is Dan Chrysler from the Omaha World Herald. Just got a question. According to the U.S. Drought Monitor in Nebraska here, pretty much all the states in some form of drought, particularly in Northeast and, well, I mean, just the highest levels of drought. It's come after, last year, there was, last year was a tough year for farming. I guess bottom line is, how does the winter weather plus the spring outlook here, is it going to help, kind of alleviate those drought conditions? I don't know if you can maybe offer any predictions on that front as it pertains to Nebraska, or?
Sure. I'll turn that over to Brad Pugh, who was the lead of our seasonal drought outlook for the spring. Brad, can you help?
Yes, yeah, this is Brad Pugh again, Climate Prediction Center. So yeah, we do expect improving drought conditions throughout the spring season across Nebraska. And that's related mostly to the increasingly wet climatology as we go in deeper into the spring. 40 to 45% of the annual precipitation typically occurs during the months of April, May, June for the central and northern Great Plains.
All right, thank you, sir.
Yep, you're welcome.
All right, thank you. Next on the line, we'll have Corey Reppenhagen. Corey, I'm unmuting you now.
Hi, Corey Reppenhagen, 9 News, KUSA in Denver. I have 2 questions. I'm not sure who you want to try to tackle these, but first question is, do you consider this winter's La Nina to be a failed teleconnection, particularly in the southwest part of the country? And the second question is, does this winter give you, this La Nina winter give you any less confidence in the teleconnection, or does it fit into the variability that you have seen through time?
Yeah, this is John Gotcher. That's a great question. To answer your first question, yes, the forecast that we issued for the Western U.S. in general was actually opposite or flipped, if you will, from the typical below normal precipitation that we often see across parts of Southern California and the Southwest, for example, and the Southern Rockies. And generally wetter across the Northern Rockies and Pacific Northwest. The Pacific Northwest this year was generally drier than normal, and as we know, a lot of the storm track was shifted further south than expected, and is often during many La Nina events. So it was very wet in your area, including Colorado. But I will say that if you look at past La Nina events over the historical record, it's not unusual to have this sort of variability from one La Nina event to another. In fact, if you look at modern La Nina events over the record that we have going back to 1948 or so, there's the potential for above normal precipitation, near normal precipitation, or below normal precipitation is almost equally likely along the West Coast and parts of the West. So it certainly fits in the variability of what we've seen in the past overall. So I hope that helps answer your question.
All right, thank you. Next, we'll go to Carlos Granda. Carlos, I'm unmuting you now.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. Carlos Granda from KBC in Los Angeles. As you know, we've had this record amount of snow and rain here in California, and it's all going to start melting. And that's the big concern I think that we have is where's it going to go? The reservoirs are near capacity in many places. Is this even going to help our drought? It's really a 2-part question. We're going to get all this rain. There's really no place to, all this snow melt, there's no place to put it. And is it really going to help our drought? Because people here are saying that despite this, we're still not really out of the woods. What are your thoughts?
So I'm going to turn that over to Brett at the California Nevada River Forecast Center. I think he can speak to the melt, the interactions with the reservoir systems across the state, and perhaps provide some insight. Brett?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. So, there is record snowpack in the Sierra, as you were kind of alluding to. So this is good for reservoir storage. We're up approximately 7.5 million acre feet in California storage since last year at this time. So already a significant gain in water supply. And this snowpack is going to benefit those reservoirs as well as it starts to melt in the spring. But it will be a challenge to manage all this snowpack. There's record snow. And so a lot of these rivers have limited channel capacity downstream. And so getting that water out safely so that they can manage it without spilling is going to be a challenge. There'll be a lot of water in a lot of the flood conveyance systems throughout the spring and into the early summer just to try to manage all that snow melt. So it's a concern for sure. Hopefully the snow comes off in a way that that the reservoir management community can manage it successfully.
Okay, thank you. All right, next we'll go to Don Jenkins, who has a hand raised and questions in the chat. I'm unmuting you now, Don.
Unmuted.
Yeah, thank you. This is Don Jenkins with the Capitol Press. Why is below average precipitation favored in the Pacific Northwest?
This is John Gotcha from the Climate Prediction Center. For two main reasons, actually three main reasons, is that for the most part, most of our initial forecast model guidance that we use for short-time climate prediction, they were more uniform and consistent for a forecast for drier than normal conditions in that area. But also as we move through the spring months into the early summer months, long-term precipitation trends, and what I mean with that is the precipitation anomalies or departures from normal over the last, say, 10 or 15 years as compared to the 30-year normal have been significantly on the negative side, meaning drier than normal conditions. So those were a couple of factors that went into releasing the probability and slightly enhanced probabilities for below normal precipitation in the Pacific Northwest.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Next on the line, we'll have AJ Burnett. I am unmuting you now, AJ.
Thank you very much. A quick question regarding the strength of the El Nino coming at us. Any idea how strong the El Nino is expected to get and its possible impacts on the tropics coming up this year?
Yeah, it's a great question. Right now, I do want to say right at the start, however, even though we're favoring the potential development of El Nino as we go into the summer and early fall, it's by no means a certainty. So I want to make that very clear. We are favoring that transition. And to that point, we're not at the point where we'll be able to get a feeling for the strength. With respect to some of the model guidance or predictions that we do have right now, it would be more of a moderate strength El Nino. But again, that's probably putting the little too early to kind of tell with respect to the magnitude and whether we'll certainty to have an El Nino. However, as your second question, if we do have an El Nino event do develop as we get into the summer months, that tends to suppress the North Atlantic hurricane seasons, as I think many of you know, with respect to the number of storms and some of the intensities of the storms. However, in the Eastern Pacific Basin, there tends to be an increase in tropical cyclone activity, and that may play a role later on in the year during the monsoon season, with potentially a increase in precipitation in parts of the Southwest. So those would be the impacts that I would look out for if, again, we move towards El Nino later in the summer and fall.
Thank you, and apologies. This is AJ Burnett from WCVB in Boston, ABC affiliate.
All right. Thank you, AJ, and thank you, John. We have a similar question in the chat that I'll go to from Hallie Parker. Can you speak a little bit more regarding how weather patterns typically change during El Nino compared to La Nina, especially in context of what it means for the Gulf Coast?
Yeah, another great question. So with respect to moving towards El Nino, again, that's the most likely outcome right now, but again, not a certainty. But if that were to happen as we get into the summer months, as I mentioned, there tends to be less shear across the less shear across the Atlantic Basin and parts of the Gulf of Mexico. And that tends to increase the tropical cyclone activity during the hurricane season in those areas. And though we don't know eventual impacts of any landfalling hurricanes or tropical cyclones, if it is an above average season, having above average season would put some potential for increased rainfall and storminess along the Gulf Coast. But again, that's pretty uncertain and quite a bit away from this part in March.
All right, thank you for clearing that up, John. Our next question on the line will come from Melissa Fieto. Melissa, I am currently unmuting you.
This is Melissa Fato from the Florida Public Radio Emergency Network. As we all know, Florida is under some pretty extensive drought coverage right now. I was wondering if any of the experts can just elaborate on why and what conditions are expected to alleviate our drought, it seems like completely by June. Thank you.
Sure. This is John Gottschalk at the Climate Prediction Center. There's two factors for that, and I'll turn it over to Brad Pugh for a follow-up. But one is related to short-term enhanced precipitation rainfall during the next couple of weeks. But also, as we go into the month of June, the rainy season in Florida really starts to ramp up pretty vigorously. And so it's anticipated that the drought by the end of June is likely to be removed or improved quite a bit across much of the Florida Peninsula. And I'll turn over to Brad for any follow-up information.
Yeah, hi, Melissa. Yeah, it was a perfect answer by John. Yeah, over the next week, we are expecting a widespread heavy rainfall across the state, especially the Panhandle and northern Florida Peninsula. So that should begin to ease drought concerns. Obviously, there could be a continuation of drought through April and May, and then, as John stated, during June, the climatology becomes rapidly, wet with time. So we are expecting the drought to end by the end of June.
All right, thank you. All right, next we'll have a question from Doyle Rice. Doyle, I'm muting you now.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for doing this. John had mentioned wildfires, and I kind of had a follow-up question about the wildfires forecast for the spring, especially in the southeast and Florida. I wonder what it's looking like for fires this year.
Yes, you bring up a very good point, Doyle. Actually, the most probably the highest concern right now with respect to fire is probably the Florida Peninsula because of the drought conditions that are ongoing there, plus unlikely to get much rain after this initial frontal system that Brad mentioned earlier. As far as more of the April-May potential period there, but as you go further out to the southwest, with the high amounts of precipitation and snowpack, there's likely to be a delay probably in the fire season in that part of the country. But it doesn't mean that it couldn't end up being a very strong season. It's just likely to be a more muted beginning for sure, and it may end up being a below average year, but we still have a little ways to go. The other area to focus on would be the Southern Plains, which is South Central High Plains, where the drought is pretty exceptional with respect. When wind conditions are elevated, there will be a potential for fire weather in those areas. But one caveat is that it's been so dry for so long, I think a lot of the fuels and grass that would burn with wildfires seems to have been really so depleted over the last year that it's kind of a mixed case in that region. But it's something certainly to keep in mind.
Okay, thank you. And next we'll have a question by Drew Costley. Drew, I am unmuting you now.
Hi, y'all. My name is Drew Costley, a reporter with the Associated Press. I would like you all to just talk a little bit more about how you expect this forecast to impact California. It seems like a lot of California and the rest of the West. It seems like a lot of the drought relief that is coming is expected is due to current heavy rainfall and snowpack. Can you just talk about how precipitation over the next few months will impact the drought in the West and in California?
Sure, that's a great question. John Gottschalk here from the Climate Prediction Center is correct. Much of the West that's shown to have improvement or removal is related to antecedent conditions or snowpack, the current snowpack and short-term precipitation moving forward. But there are two areas that may see drought development due to favored below normal precipitation. That is parts of Washington State in the Pacific Northwest. And also later on in the spring, as we start to head towards the monsoon season and the convective season in the southeastern parts of the Southwest, we expect below normal precipitation there as well. And so drought development may also develop or creep into parts of New Mexico by the end of June.
All right, thank you. Does it? All right, that answers Drew's question. All right, next we'll go to Susan Montoya Bryan. I'm unmuting you now, Susan.
Yes, good morning. Thanks for taking our questions. Susan Montoya Bryan with the Associated Press out here in the Southwest. And I know Brett had mentioned earlier the favorable conditions for the reservoirs in California, but maybe Paul could speak a little bit more about the Colorado Basin and some of our biggies like Meade and Powell, and how over the long term, how much of an impact this extra moisture we've seen will actually have on those reservoirs and what we could look for further into the year.
Sure. Sure, I can speak to that a little bit. So the Bureau of Reclamation makes the operational decisions on how those reservoirs are operated, and they take our forecasts and run that information through their hydrologic models to best decide how to manage those water resources. So it's not entirely up to us. So with that being said, the Bureau of Reclamation just released their latest 24-month study report, which is a projection of how those reservoirs are going to respond to the inflow that we're expected to see. And Lake Powell is expected to rise about 35 feet in its surface water elevation, which sounds like a lot, and it is a lot of water, but currently Lake Powell is about 23-25% full. And even rising 35 feet, that only puts it at about 36%-ish capacity. I have to double check those numbers. So, you know, it's definitely moving in the right direction, but we're far from filling the reservoirs in the Colorado River system, and we're far from being at a comfortable point from a water supply perspective. Lake Meade is really dictated by outflow from Glen Canyon Dam. So that really is a decision from the Bureau of Reclamation and how they're going to operate releases from Glen Canyon Dam and move that water between those two reservoirs.
All right. Great, thank you. Next, we have a question in chat from Matthew Chase, and this is for a particular region. His question is, what is the forecast for the New York region and Long Island in particular, the city of Yale and Long Island?
Yeah, this is John Gottschalk from the Climate Prediction Center. For the tri-state area in that region, first for temperature, pretty high odds for above normal temperatures for that region, along with the rest of the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. For precipitation, there's also an elevated chance or odds for above normal precipitation as well. So generally favoring warmer and wetter conditions for that region during the upcoming spring.
All right, thank you. All right, we have some more hands raised. Hallie Parker, your hand's raised. I'm gonna unmute you now, Hallie.
Hi, this is Hallie Parker from New Orleans Public Radio. I was just hoping to get a little bit more clarification regarding the higher flood risk for upriver in the Mississippi River Basin. Like, how could that possibly affect us farther downriver, like in New Orleans?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Grashel. He's the Service Coordination Hydrologist down there in Slidell at the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center. Jeff, I don't know if you want to take this, and then if we need to, Masha could speak again to the drivers upstream.
Sure. Yeah, this is Jeff Grushel, Service Coordination Hydrologist for the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center, and a good question too. We do have like was already mentioned, the chances of above normal flood risk on the upper part of the Mississippi River. But as you probably well know, the Ohio and the Tennessee kind of contribute more to the lower part of the Mississippi River than the upper part of the Mississippi or the Missouri River. So based on what we're seeing in Ohio and Tennessee, we're kind of just looking at normal conditions for the lower part of the Mississippi River near the New Orleans area.
Thank you.
All righty. We have one more question or one more hand raised from Corey Reppenhagen again. Corey, I'm going to unmute you. So.
Thank you. I appreciate another question here. Corey from Denver again. My question is about the atmospheric rivers that developed over the winter. Can you put any context in how they might or may not relate to La Nina? Is that maybe why the Pacific Northwest is favored wetter and it just went south? Or was this pattern really just completely unprecedented?
This is John Gottschalk at the Climate Prediction from the Climate Predictions, and that's a great question. It was actually more related to what we would call variability or changes within the season or subseasonal changes. One of the factors that did play a role, and there was a few, but one of them was the existence of a tropical disturbance that's called the Madden-Julian Oscillation, or MJO, that tends to operate through the global tropics as well and produces impacts to North America and the Pacific that are similar to ENSO, but as opposed to having those impacts be additive on seasonal averages, the change is going to occur over a few weeks or 2 or 3 weeks. And so what we had happen, at least with the January events, late December into January events, is that we had a lot of subtropical and tropical moisture that was in the right place due to a Madden-Julian oscillation, and the jet stream and the troughing across the eastern part of the North Pacific was just right in the right place that it was able to link up both the northern stream and southern stream of the jet stream, which is the flow of air in the upper levels of the atmosphere. We're able to link up, and the storm track, as I mentioned earlier, was able to be further south and produce a lot of precipitation right into central Southern California, the Southwest, as well as Northern California, parts of Southern Oregon. But that's one reason a lot of the moisture went into that area and why the Pacific Northwest ended up being dry in that region. I hope that helps.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, with that being our last question, I'd like to thank John Moore on my team for facilitating the Q&A part, and tell the reporters for all those great questions. And before we conclude, I'd like to thank all of our experts who participated from across NOAA, the National Water Center, the Climate Prediction Center, the River Forecast Centers, and our federal partner agencies at FEMA and Agriculture. If you have any questions following this news conference, please reach out to my team, National Weather Service Public Affairs, by email at nws.pa@noaa.gov or by phone at 301-427-9000. The Spring Outlook news release with the outlook and flood risk maps are available at noaa.gov, and there's a link in the chat window here. And audio and video from this news conference will be added to the news release this afternoon. So thank you for joining us and have a great day.